I went in Pamir because it was circumstances which enabled me to go over to Port Victoria to see them, and probably there was an underlying desire, without me really knowing it at the time, to go on one of these sailing ships. My great-grandfather was a sea captain, and his father was a sea captain and so on, so maybe it was in me to feel some urge in that way. And I said to my mother, I wonder what it would be like to go and sail in one of these old sailing ships. And most mothers would say, of course, you know, well, there's no way you're going to find out. You're not going on one of those things. But my old mum was an incredible woman, and as far as anything like that is concerned, and we wanted to, I got two brothers, and if we wanted to go on and a sailing ship like that, go and find out. So I did. And next day I went down to the jetty at Port Victoria, because the caravan was park was just up from the jetty itself, and I happened to bump into the two captains, Captain Bjorkfeld of the Pamir and Captain Huggerstrand of the Passet. And I went up to them, and I was only 20 years old at the time, so I was a little bit dubious about doing just this, marching up to a couple of old sea captains. However, I went and asked either or both of them, what's the chances of going, signing on as a crew on one of these sailing ships? And Bjorkfeld of Pamir, he said, well, look, we're sailing very soon, we are loaded up, and we probably will be sailing in 2 or 3 days' time. Thursday night, I was on board, and it was shocking weather. It was a southwesterly. This was in May the 27th. So all I can remember from there on was they threw all the gear up there when the dory boat came into the jetty to get me, and there I was, a stranger, knew nothing about the ship. No, I didn't even know the names of the sails in order. So I next morning, being late afternoon like it was, I then just got used to my bunk, put my things inside. Next day I had to go out on deck and start learning all about all that I could. And that was the Friday. Saturday morning at 10 o'clock we set sail. So the availability of me being able to learn a little about the ship was virtually zilch. But eventually it didn't take long to really, get the picture. And as a result of that, I started learning what to do, where to go, and being on my own, of course, and a stranger, I was a very, very lonely boy. But then we set sail, and it was a southwesterly breeze, and we went out below below Kangaroo Island, on the west side of Kangaroo Island, and started sailing. My first job on that sailing ship was to climb right up to the top, to the truck of the foremast, to get some gear down from up there that had been put up there to help put the sails up and in Port Victoria. And when I started climbing up there, and it's about 180 feet from the deck, and when I started climbing up the top there, I had no idea really what I was letting myself in for. I didn't know how to climb out on what they call the futtock shrouds, which is a first set out on the cross trees, and you had to climb out underneath that, and then up the next lot, and then underneath the topgallants, and on from there. Had I been able to, I think, jump overboard and swim ashore, or jump on a boat, I no doubt would have done it, because I thought, well, if I've got to get up this mast, this high and this awkward, down south in the rough conditions that are going to be obviously be down there, I don't need that. But there was no way, of course, of being able to swim ashore. I was on that ship, and that's where I was going to stay for 4 months. Well, as it happened, then we got down off Tasmania, and we had a heading of the wind, so we were quite a while, 3 or 4 or 5 days I think it was, off the west coast of Tasmania, waiting for the wind to go around so we'd get around the bottom of Tasmania and go down to the roaring 40s and go on from there. Well, the weather, I had no idea what the weather would be like down there. As I say, it was heading towards the middle of winter. By this time, most sailing ships in the old days and before that, they had left in March, February and March, and of course the weather wasn't as bad. You know, they were past the worst part, and between New Zealand and the Horn, they were past there by the time the really rough weather would set about, and certainly the middle of winter. But there we were in the middle of winter. In fact, we went around Cape Horn in the 12th of July, and that couldn't have been more in the middle of, literally in the middle of winter, and boy was it cold. But even 3 jumpers and goodness knows what else didn't keep you very warm. Waterproofs were a great help in that way. You wore them, and the boots that I had put on board, rubber boots. But the actual weather itself, you got very used to it as far as the ship is concerned. We were 45 days between Port Victoria and getting to Cape Horn, which wasn't bad time actually, but with the wind like it was pretty, being rough and cold, it was to be expected, put it that way. Well, when at one stage down there in the big seas, and when I say big seas, nobody can really comprehend how big they are unless honestly they have been down and experienced. These boys that go down to the polar business and that, they would have a pretty good idea what it's like. The waves can be anything up to 3/4 of a mile in between the crests and the crests, and the big swells and with they have 3 huge waves on top of them. They can be up and down like that. And what I did notice with it, when we're under lower to'gallant maybe and topsails only, you would go down the troughs. The ship would go down into the troughs of the waves, and the sails would start to back, even though it was blowing, we'll say 40, 50 mile an hour, the sails would start to back because the wind is coming over the tops of the waves and curling sort of into the troughs, and therefore as you were shooting down those waves, the wind would be effective, coming back on you as well as the speed, and it would come back, and the sails would have a tendency to sort of just flutter. But then as the wave picked the ship up and went up to the top, it was like a hurricane up there with the wind blowing around, and when you're at the crest of the wave. And this went on for day after day after day, and you just got used to it. And the seas would hit the side of the ship and come up over, wash the deck, and of course also they would come on, and that's when the danger part came into. If you were working in the well deck, in the forward and aft section of the well deck, then the sea came on. What would happen is that a huge mountainous wave would come and just wash you along the deck if you didn't hang on to the life lines that were stretched along there. And the big danger that was then when the ship rolled back, all that sea would come sucking back over the boards, and as a result, if you didn't have hold of anything, it would suck you back over, and that's why they had safety nets going along there. Steering on Pamir was a little bit different to the old sailing ships where the wheel was on the poop and the after part of the ship. But our wheel at on Pamir was in the midship section. The auxiliary wheel, or the reserve one, was under the poop after in the ship, but the master wheel, where it was steered all the time, was in the midship section just forward of the chart house and after the main mast. So you could look straight up the mast from where you were at the wheel, and you could see the royal or the upper sail, so that it would, you know, you could tell whether you're going too high if you had to, pointing it too high on the wind, and it would sort of back a little bit, so you'd pull the wheel off like that. But when it came to the very, very strong wind, like the 50 mile an hour, all you could do really was, if the ship was trimmed properly, and the old man and the first mate and second, they knew when it was hard to handle and a sail had to come off or had to be put on to be able to make trim, in other words, trim the sails to trim the ship. And as a result of that, it made it a lot easier. In fact, it almost necessary to be able to control the ship, particularly when you're going down those huge seas behind you. Because many a ship in the old days, with a big fear, was that if it got out of control and it got sideways on, it would broach and the wave coming behind you, huge curlers, as they call them, huge curler, and millions of tons of water would just come straight over the top and press the ship in. I understand at one stage, when we were between New Zealand and the Horn, I didn't realise it at the time, and we were down below waiting to be called out if necessary, dark, night time. And I only learnt a little while ago from one of my other shipmates that the old man was up on deck on this occasion, and the ship evidently went down one of these shooters like that and almost broached, but certainly a huge wave hit it and came on top of us like that, as if and she wallowed. The ship actually did wallow in the water with all this water on top of her. And the old man said to one of our ABs, and this particular one that told me only a few months ago, as it happens, and he said that the old man said to him, because he was with him on deck, he said, "I didn't think she was going to come to the surface." So it must have been relatively, close in that way, because the old man wouldn't say that. He'd been around Cape Horn 16 times. Haggerston had been around 30 odd times. So you can tell that things like that can happen if she's swamped and too much water, and we were heavily laden with cargo, we were right down to the maximum in the water line, then of course it just won't come up, and it'll just get pressed down, another wave come on top, and that's when some of them do just disappear for no reason at all.
What was the old man like? Just start off by saying Captain Bjorkfeld. Captain Bjorkfeld was a master seaman. Most of those Scandinavian captains were just fantastic as far as being using those old sailing ships the way in which they should be used. They knew the sea, they knew. In fact, at one stage there, the old man came up, and I saw him during the day, came up and he was snooping around like this sort of thing. We wondered what the heck was he snooping around. He could smell something. He could smell ice. And as a result of that, and being late in the year like that, it was quite possible for ice to be in that area, because earlier it doesn't usually come. It's got to give time to break up and so on from the summer. Well, 3 days later, one of our ABs was up the mast and he yelled out, "Icebergs!" And sure enough, the old man shot out, and he even went up part way up the ratlins, which is the equivalent to the ladder, as we call it on land. He shot part way up the ratlins, looked out, and there were 2 icebergs. They were not close, but they were certainly a little way off, far enough to make it real from the point of view that come the next night, and being halfway between New Zealand and the Horn, goodness knows how many icebergs were around at the time. So a double watch was put on straight away, of course, up on the forecastle, which was, to say, a bit terrifying to be up there pacing backwards and forwards on the forecastle, and one up on the cross trees looking for the ice or any icebergs that might be further on. But the thing with him was that we wondered how he could smell the icebergs, and what it is a chill on the nose, and they can tell straight away if there's a chill in the air that is a sign that there might be, and sure enough he was spot on. Whereas if I'd been there, I'd seen an iceberg and bang into it. So that's the way he was absolutely a master seaman. What was your worst experience on that run?
For me personally, the most frightening experience was one time down south, and I was sent up to the upper topsail, which is the 3rd sail up the mast. And it's just below, or just above, the actual first cross trees. Now when I had to come down, my hands were so cold and so freezing cold, and everything was so cold, that as I climbed under what I said before, the futtock shrouds, which is sloped in underneath the cross trees itself, I reached down, put one leg down, and reached down and got hold of the futtock shroud, one of them, put my hand on there, which was chilled cold, and swung down to be able to catch hold of the one alongside it with my left hand. I did that, and I had my feet on the ratlins down below as I sort of climbed down, and I felt my hand go. I didn't know it had gone, but I felt my body swing like this, and I sort of swung out, and I thought, gee, I haven't got hold of the other shroud. So, and then all of a sudden I realised that I was very close to letting go with this hand, and that had I done that, I may have been able to shoot my legs between the ratlins and hook myself sort of upside down on the ratlins. But if I hadn't, or where my feet were, I'd have just tumbled on down to the deck and maybe overboard or anything else. But I managed to make a good enough grip on that shroud, and then swing back and grab it with that one. And I don't know how long I was there getting my breath back, but it felt like about an hour. And you know, it was just, I was shaking. I really was shaking. It probably was, looking back on it, it was probably the most frightening, even more so than the hurricane, which of course was hit us up in the Cape Verde Islands off the West African coast.
The Pamir was the last commercial sailing ship to round Cape Horn. When interviewed in 2004, Keith McCoy was the last man living who was in the after part of that ship on that night. Therefore, he could rightly claim to be the last Cape Horner.
It was night time when we went around Cape Horn, and the first mate, the bosun, and one of the ABs was on the poop when we actually went around. I was just underneath being on the poop, there was the place underneath it where the other wheel was, and I just happened to be down below when I heard them say, "We're rounded the Horn." So, but at the present time, every one of those three men on the poop are dead. So, put it this way, I'm the last surviving Cape Horner at the present time. When I go, I don't know who was, but we were being the last square rigger, commercial square rigger, to go around Cape Horn was the Pamir, and they were the people that were on it as we went around by the records and by the log, and they were the last ones on the poop to go. So from that point of view, now I am the last one. When Eric Newby wrote that book, The Last Grain Race, which was in the Mashulu, he was probably at that time thinking that he was going to be the last, because he was in the last grain race. And there were other ships in it, but I understand the Mashulu won that particular race against the other ones. So when he talks about it being the last grain race, yes, it probably was as far as he was concerned, but he was not to know that after the war there was going to be another grain race, and that was going to be between Passet and Pamir.
Can you go on to explain that?
And it was probably very unusual that did occur. The year before, 1948, Pamir went around Cape Horn to England and came into London docks. And when they got in there, but it wasn't there was no grain race as such. They just went around on their own around that. There was no Passet, or there was no Law Hill or anything like that. But when it came to 1949, Pamir, which had been a war prize in 1939-40, it was being handed back to the Ericsson shipping line, who owned it when it was taken as a war prize by the New Zealanders. So that's why when they got a cargo here in South Australia, Passet came from Perth, and I think she was at Busselton or somewhere there, and she came around also, and she had a cargo of wheat, but we had a cargo of barley. And so the two ships, being after the harvest like that, the two ships happened to be in Port Victoria to be able to load both these loads of grain to go back to England. When Passet almost had finished loading, and Pamir had finished loading. It meant they were going to be pretty close to each other. We learnt, and I learnt for some reason, I don't know why, when I signed on Pamir, that Passett, Haggerstrand, intended to go around Cape of Good Hope, which was meant sailing around the Lewin and then going up the top of the Indian Ocean to follow the winds around and then come down like they used to in the old days. Now, that time of the year, you were getting into, as I say, the winter time with the prevailing winds. And of course, when Haggerstrand did intend to and started to sail in that direction, he got off near the Lewin somewhere, and he couldn't get around. He couldn't get, like, you know, going around Cape Horn the hard way, west about, which, you know, has got a record in itself of being absolutely murder to try and get around, particularly when it's in the middle of winter like that. So, as a result, he then squared away, being off the Lewin, and or not quite as far as that, he squared away, as they call it, and came around the south and made for the south of Tasmania, whereby at the time, you know, I said previously, we were beating up and down the west coast, trying to waiting for the wind to sort of square around a little bit so that we could then get around the bottom of Tasmania. So both ships, even though he left after us, about 3 or 4 days after us, it meant that both ships were heading for the south of Tasmania almost at the same time. And in fact they did. So when they went like that, then neither ship saw the other at any stage, except perhaps one occasion the Passett boys say they saw us way down between New Zealand and Hobart or Tasmania. They saw us way in the distance. Now, whether they were north or south of us, I have no idea. But as a consequence of that, that was the only time either ship was perhaps visually caught to see where they were. But after that, we went on, and that was it. So that when we thought we might see each other, or looking back on it, it's a wonder we didn't see each other when we crossed the equator, because both ships were hit by the same hurricane, but Passett not as severely as us at that particular time. As to who won the last grain race, it's a very bit dubious as far as I am concerned, because, and a lot of us, when we got to the English Channel, we didn't have very strong winds at any way during the North Atlantic voyage, part of it. And when we got to the English Channel, we had headwinds, and our orders were to get to Falmouth, and as was Passett's. But when we were trying to get up the channel, we were out there for days and days on end. And as a result of that, Passett, again, we didn't see them, but we found out later that Haggerstrand squared away and went to Cork in south of Ireland, so that he wouldn't have to beat all the way up and spend days and days and even weeks trying to get up to Falmouth. But I think the reason why we had to make Falmouth, we didn't know it at the time, was that Bjorkfeld had been given orders that Gustav Eriksson's son, Edgar, was going to be at Falmouth to get on board the ship to go to where our orders were going to take us to unload, and which did eventually happen. But we had to spend a lot more time beating up to our home port for orders. So in that position, when Passett squared away and got to Cork, she saved days and days at sea. In fact, they took 110 days. We got into Falmouth 127 days. So that, it depends on whether you term getting to port like that is winning the grain race, or whether it comes at a distance where we maybe have got off the Lizard. Now, I have no idea, and I don't know whether it's ever been worked out, that getting off the Lizard there before going to splitting our destinations, whether that would be counted as having won or lost a grain race, I don't suppose anybody would really know, unless they got the log of both ships and worked out the latitude and longitude position where they were on a particular day at that time.
So that was the end of the last grain race. Keith McCoy returned to Australia and eventually became an airline pilot, which is quite a difference from being on a sailing ship. Subsequent to that, the Cape Horners, the men who'd sailed on the last of the sailing ships, the Passat and the Viking and all the others, used to have a reunion. I don't know when it started, but it was certainly in full swing through the 1980s and 1990s and so on. They were still having them into the 2000s, but the last one was held in 2009 at Port Victoria, and I was along to take some photos and meet some of the old guys who I'd actually met before in 2004 when I interviewed them for the video, The Last Cape Horners, which can be seen on YouTube, which covers the history of the Cape Horn, or especially the last grain races. So Keith McCoy was there and a lot of the other old guys, Alf Jarvis and Maurice Crigliano in different ones. So it was good to have a catch up. That was a great event. If you want to see more of the last Cape Horners and those old sailing ships and the whole story, you better have a look at my video on YouTube, The Last Cape Horners by Gary Kerr.